As part of the Buddha's enlightenment experience, he was able to see back to all his previous births. Welcome to Brixton Tree Ratna's Dharma Night. My name is Amra Pushpa, and tonight we're going to continue in a new series we started last week, based on a book by Sangha called The Three Jewels of Buddhism. And the three jewels being the jewel of the Buddha, the jewel of the Dharma, his teaching, and the jewel of the Sangha, the community of his followers. And for the next few weeks, we're just going to be exploring the Buddha jewel. So just to recap a little from last week, well, obviously there'd be no Buddhism without this figure of the Buddha. And what the Buddha is has been interpreted through many cultures, thousands of years of history. We're exploring in this series the richness of all that and the very many ways there are to connecting with the Buddha. So last week we talked about the Buddha as a historical figure who lived in India over 2,500 years ago. And the period after his death, so the first couple of hundred years, there being quite a lot of focus on the many teachings he gave, which people memorized. There was hardly any written recording at the time, but people at the time had great memories, and great stress for a couple of hundred years was placed on what the Buddha said. And then there started being more of a movement of followers who were more interested in who the Buddha was. So what are the qualities of an enlightened being? And that started all sorts of meditations and traditions around color and symbol and mantra, this type of connecting with the Buddha's enlightenment qualities. But that's just a broad overview. So there's so many different ways to connect with the Buddha. This week we're exploring a very interesting, another very rich tradition around the Buddha. And this is around a tradition of a collection of many stories around the Buddha's previous births. So as part of the Buddha's enlightenment experience, he was able to see back to all his previous births and how he was reborn. And he said since then that this was an attainment of someone who had a higher conscious mind, someone who had developed himself meditatively. There are attainments that one could have, psychic attainments. He said this is not a ability crucial to enlightenment, but this was part of the enlightenment experience. And I guess for us Westerners, this whole area of rebirth can feel a bit alien. So where it was very natural, very much a part of the Indian culture he was in. And we can often conflate the Buddhist idea of rebirth with reincarnation, which is more of a Hindu belief. From a Buddhist perspective, when we die, we don't believe that everything ends at death. At the same time, we don't believe that there's an eternal life of a soul that goes on from one body to the next. So rebirth involves this continuation of a psycho-spiritual energy that is part of the process of what happens after death. And it's compared more like if there's a candle with a flame, that the flame passes from one candle onto the next candle. So, it's not the same candle, but there is an energy that passes on to the next life. And so it's quite different. So it isn't the same soul or the same, because in Buddhism, everything is in process, so there isn't this fixed soul. But the way we act ethically has some bearing on how we're reborn. However, there isn't a static story that if one is reborn in poor circumstances, the Buddha was very clear. That doesn't mean that you can't conclude that that person had committed evil acts in a previous life. He says that it's a mystery. We can't know. We know that our acts have an effect, but we can't know what the effect is. So this is quite important to avoid narratives where if someone is wealthy, they might think it's because they're virtuous and they deserve it just by reason of being born wealthy. And it can lead to all sorts of wrong views from the Buddhist perspective, such as the caste system, where people were born poor. They're seen to have, that's one aspect where they're held down or fixed by reason of their birth. And the Buddha spoke a lot about that. So I just wanted to clarify a few things about what we mean in rebirth in Buddhism. And so a couple of hundred years after the Buddha died, I guess in India there was a lot of curiosity about his previous births and also what happened to a Buddha after he died. And, particularly, what were the previous births of an enlightened being? And a whole tradition arose around telling stories around the Buddha's previous lives that were quite beautiful and have a lot of depth. They're very rich, and they're also often have been used in the Buddhist tradition as teaching stories. And through this series of rebirths, sometimes some of the stories have the Buddha as an animal or all sorts of walks of life, from being a treasurer to a trader to a peasant to a king. They're a very wonderful way of connecting to a more human side of the Buddha. And in each of these lives, he would practice what is known as the paramitas, or the perfections, so of a bodhisattva. So a bodhisattva is a being who aspires to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all human beings. And it's said a bodhisattva has a career of developing through many, many lifetimes. Enlightenment is such a huge achievement that from certain perspectives, it can be seen as something that would require many lifetimes to achieve. So that's the perspective of these birth tales, known as Jataka stories. So Jata, the word Jata meaning birth. And I'll just mention a couple of these rich stories. Just to give you an example. I think they're wonderful in terms of the wisdom, the psychology, the insight that they have, but also they exemplify great generosity. So one of the famous ones is about called the Monkey King. So in this story, the Buddha was a king of monkeys, and he led about 80,000 monkeys. And they discovered this incredibly rich mango tree, and they had all this wonderful food to themselves. But the Monkey King, in his wisdom, said, we must make sure not one mango drops to the ground, because it'd be very dangerous for us. So he had them gather all the mangoes and keep them in store, but one mango got away and dropped into the river. And that's how a hunter who was going going through the forest, saw the mango and discovered the tree. And soon there was a whole troop of human beings, a whole clan who came, and they started taking the mangoes, killing the monkeys. And the Monkey King helped the monkeys escape through an incredibly brave act. They were in a very, very tight position, but this Monkey King stretched. Apparently he got on top of a bendy branch and then somehow like a catapult flung himself across this chasm and stretched his body so all these monkeys could escape. And he managed to survive. The king was so impressed by his bravery that he was rewarded. So that's one of the stories. Apparently there are over 500 stories. I'll just tell one last story, which I find really remarkable. It's called the Queen's Necklace. And in this story, as in a lot of the stories from that period, there's a king who has a harem of wives, and they live in a pleasure palace. And the king decides to go into the bathing tank with his many wives, and each wife has an attendant. And so the wives take off their beautiful garments and their jewelry, and each attendant is looking after their belongings. And again, the story involves monkeys. There's a monkey who looks down and sees the queen's pearl necklace, and the monkey is very, very attracted to it. But she sees this attendant guarding the jewels. But gradually, the attendant just drifts off to sleep, and the monkey sees her moment, and she goes down and snatches the necklace, and she hides it in a hole in a tree. And the story describes this monkey sitting demurely in front of this hole with the pearl necklace inside. And the king and his harem come out, and they're very distraught. This very valuable necklace has gone missing. So there's a big hoo-ha. And a lowly peasant hears all this shouting, and he's scared, so he runs. And they immediately think he's the one who stole the necklace. So they grab this peasant, and they say, you stole the necklace, didn't you? And the peasant realizes if he denies it, he'll be beaten, because he knows he looks guilty. So they go to the treasurer, and the treasurer again feels he can't deny his guilt, because they all think he's guilty. And he said, no, I gave it to the priest. And it goes on and on. I gave it to the musician. I gave it to somebody, because they all think nobody's going to believe they're not guilty. But there's this wise minister who realizes none of these people could have had access to the jewelry. And he assigns a servant, because all of them are arrested. He assigns a servant to listen to their conversation. And he tells the other servants, he tells the other servants to put out cheap beads and for the monkeys. And so the other monkeys take these cheap bead necklaces and put them on their neck. And the minister says, look out for a monkey wearing the queen's pearl necklace. So these other monkeys put on these cheap necklaces, and the monkey with the pearl necklace can't bear not to be able to show off her much more superior necklace. And as soon as she jumps down, they scare the monkey, and she drops the pearl necklace. So I love this story, and I love the psychology and the wisdom of it. So I think the minister, in telling the story, it's the Buddha telling the story. He said, I was a minister in that previous life. And I think it very much, to me, relates to how much wisdom the Buddha would bring, how much he understood the psychology of the people he was teaching in the different situations in his lifetime. And maybe I'll discuss that with Amaladana, as my friend here, Amaladana, we're going to just have a bit more of a discussion about some of these wonderful tales.
Thanks for the stories, Pushpa. I don't really know much about the origin of the Jataka stories, or where they came from, whether the Buddha told any of the stories or what.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a mystery where they came from. I mean, some are supposedly told in the Pali Canon. So the Pali is the Buddha's original language, and the Pali Canon has what is known as the most authentic texts of the Buddha. And in the Pali Canon, the Buddha just describes the previous life, where he was a wise sage or something like that. So none of these more elaborate. Well, they're almost like folk stories. I think in a way there's this kind of folk wisdom that comes into them. And as I say, they're very old, but nobody quite knows where. A great body of them, 500 of them, they believe, or in commentary, or they've just come down over the centuries, and they're very loved in certain cultures. But I think as Western Buddhists, I haven't studied them very much myself.
They sound like they'd be ideal for children.
Yes.
I mean, it's very.
Yes.
It's the sort of thing that you, like folk stories, you can hear them and enjoy them. And
Yes.
get the message as an adult quite quickly, probably. As a
That's
child,
right.
it's probably
Yes.
more alive.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, but they also do have, morals and, so which is good for children, but also, these insight into human psychology, like the minister in that last story, really understanding the psychology, for example, of the peasant who automatically confessed because of his conditioning. He didn't think he'd be believed.
Yeah.
He knew knowing the psychology of the monkey who'd stolen the necklace. So there's a kind of wisdom or seeing that relates to me of the stories of the historical Buddha.
What I liked about it was that I think, like in lots of those sorts of folk stories, you find yourself putting yourself in the position of the monkey and of the minister and
right.
of the various people.
Yes.
I think, what would I have done? And
Yes,
and
that's
it's
right.
sort of so in a way, I think you find yourself examining your own behaviour, in relation
Yes.
to the story.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it kind of, when we have mostly a very idealized, enlightened being, a Buddha, but thinking of his previous lives, in all these different guises, as in another wonderful one, he's a merchant, and or he's a treasurer, or there are all sorts of roles he plays that are kind of just everyday, kind of connects us in an everyday way to the Buddha.
So I was wondering, actually, when you were talking, what perhaps your experience with the idea of rebirth is, whether that's changed over your, over the years you've been practicing.
Yeah, I have found it really alien. It's like I've had kind of and it really has thrown me up against. I realize what a strong conditioning I have, this kind of scientific, materialist kind of view, and yet it makes sense to me. And as a follower of a Buddha, I have a complete faith in his teachings, and there are all sorts of experiences people have. There's this amazing series on Netflix called Surviving Death, and there's some very riveting stories of children remembering previous births. And it's a bit like what the Buddha said about rebirth. It's not like that person has come back whole into another life. I mean, the child seems to remember certain details from like age 3 that nobody else could possibly remember. Uncanny, and yet in some of these instances they put the person together with the child with the family, and it clearly isn't the same person. So it just kind of, that kind of, to me, resonates with this whole idea of rebirth. That psycho-spiritual, or what would say is karmic energy, is just one of many conditions that might be carried forward.
Yeah, I love that idea of actually an energy being moving, and moving from sort of life to life, and always changing, and always changeable, it's funny because I personally, I do remember a time when I had this, the materialistic view, and I was quite clear on it, but I don't ever remember challenging myself about that idea. But the more I thought about the idea of this, this stream of energy, if you like, that goes through lives, I felt much more comfortable. So it's a sort of beautiful idea,
Yes.
And reading, just listening to you talking, I was just thinking about how it changes our whole perspective, the story of the Bodhisattva and their previous lives. If we believe that and the rebirths, then our whole perspective on our being here is changed, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, it's not that we can't gain enlightenment in one lifetime. I suppose it could be possible, but there's also not only all these previous births of practice, there's also different world systems and Buddhas of different eras, in this whole Indian cosmology in which the Buddha, the historical Buddha lived. And there's a story about a previous Buddha in a previous world system, and the Buddha of our world system being just a spiritual follower who saw Dipankara, that was that Buddha, and he was so full of reverence, he threw himself down over a puddle and asked Dipankara to walk on him, which sounds quite servile, but what Dipankara saw was how fervently this follower wanted to gain enlightenment, and he predicted, you will gain enlightenment. And next recording we're going to look at the historical Buddha, what we know that historical, and supposedly that was his last lifetime after these series of lifetimes.
And I think is it Sumedha?
Yes, Sumedha, that's right, he was Sumedha.
He spent successive lives, didn't he? Yeah, perfecting.
Yes, that's right.
You mentioned it, didn't the perfections, the paramitas.
Yes.
And so achieved his goal to be like Dipankara. Yeah. That's
right. Yeah, I love some of the details. There are often stories about misers in these Jataka. And then the way to describe this, one story, this miser who is so miserly, he couldn't even bear to give away a drop of oil off a blade of grass, that kind of tiny amount. Yeah. And I love this story because at one point he sees this peasant really enjoying an alcoholic drink. And he so wants this alcoholic drink, or to drink alcohol himself, because he was so miserly, he despised himself and everybody else of enjoyment of all these riches. But he got taken over by this craving, and they said he was craving it so much, he turned yellow like an old piece of cotton cloth. I just love those details. And in the end, his wife asks him what's wrong, and he tells her, yes. And she said, well, let's brew some alcohol and give it to everybody here. He said, no, well, let's just have it with the family. No. Well, what about you and I just having this drink of alcohol? And he says, no, you don't really need alcohol. And he was just didn't want to share, that in the end he sent a slave out to get him some alcohol and bring it to him in this bush where he could enjoy it all to himself. That's really so interesting. And then the story goes on from there. But I just love all these, very dramatic, very live, vivid details.
Sort of brings to mind Scrooge, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly, Scrooge.
You can see him sort of having his awakening and,
Yes.
and reversing all that behaviour.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things like people disguising themselves, like in Shakespearean plays, or two identical husbands, like in The Return of Martin Gare. You know.
Oh yeah.
You know, so it's just rich. I'm really wanting to explore them more.
Oh, well, I think you've got me wanting to explore them as well.
So yeah, but I'll just say one last thing about the psychology. You know, that story with the minister understanding the psychology. It made me think of the historical Buddha, which we'll be looking at next, and how he helped a woman who was going insane out of grief of the death of her only child. And like he did with many people, he didn't just tell her what to do or give her a teaching. He saw her psychology, he really understood, and he said, bring me a mustard seed from a house that hasn't experienced any death, and I'll help bring, because she was looking for someone to bring her child back to life. And the woman, Siddhartha Gautama, went to house, and, you know, do you have a mustard seed? And they'd say, yes. Oh, great. And then, has anyone died here? And everyone would say yes. And gradually she came to understand that, you know,
oh, you're welcome.
Mortality was a part of human existence, and she was able to let go. She couldn't let go of her dead child, and she was able to let it go. And I was just always been so moved by the wisdom and the depth of understanding of that woman's psychology.
Yeah, and the way she had to come to the realization, but he helped her.
That's right.
Come to it, but you know, she had to do the work herself.
Yes.
Didn't she become enlightened?
She did. She became a follower, but it reminds me of that minister who understood the monkey psychology, the peasant psychology. He knew what would work, you know. So yeah.
That's a lovely story.
Great, so I hope you enjoyed that Dharma Night talk. So if you did enjoy it, if you're enjoying our videos, I just want to ask you or encourage you to think about making a donation to the Brixton Buddhist community. We're a UK charity that relies completely on your donations to run everything here. And if this was a class, a meditation class, there'd be a donation bowl that you could just put in £10 at the end of the night to help support the activities. But as you're watching this online, I just want to ask you to think about making an online donation. If you've watched 4 or 5 videos this month, maybe you might want to think about giving £10. So there's a link in the description below where you can go to our website and make a donation. And if you want to keep giving and you don't want to worry about making that donation every month, well, you could just set us up a standing order, a monthly standing order. That would be really, really helpful. I want to suggest something of the region of maybe £10 or £20 a month if you're able to do that, and that would be really, really helpful and help us keep producing videos like this one. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself.